Thank you, Justin, for being here, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Justin Romack is a program coordinator for assistive technology services in the Department of Disability Resources at Texas A&M University. In this role, he works with students, faculty, and staff to achieve equitable access to the Aggie experience for disabled students and works to educate the campus community on its shared responsibility for accessibility and inclusion. Justin enjoys unraveling the complexity of technical accessibility requirements to equip and empower leaders, communicators, and creatives to make decisions and develop resources which provide access to all information, opportunities, and experiences. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Justin Romack. Thank you so much for being here today, Justin.
Yeah, you bet. Howdy, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction, for facilitating this moment in time. I think it's amazing that we can all gather together in a space like this when we're all living through such an unprecedented season that just seems to be on repeat. My name is Justin Romack, and as Dr. Orsak mentioned, I am a program coordinator with Disability Resources. I am a white man. I have a beard. I am bald-headed. I am wearing a black polo shirt with our Disability Resources logo on what would be your right side. And I want to be very purposeful about how I conduct myself through this presentation, because as I share information with you, I want to be a good model of that as well. And so I think that I hope that and know that as we move forward in this presentation together, you'll see some examples of some of these things that I'm talking about. And I hope that it encourages you to be mindful about those things in the presentations that you give as well. So I want to talk a little bit about our agenda for today, just so you have some expectations for what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about some opportunities and barriers that accompany the online event or presentation space. We're going to talk about promoting and preparing for accessibility as you're planning for your presentations and programs. We're going to talk about keys to accessible presentation. So what does an accessible presentation look like? And then I want to talk a little bit about fostering inclusion and fostering inclusion during your event. So how can we bring people in so that that experience is equitable across the board? And then I sort of jokingly have this odds and ends, things that just didn't fit necessarily in all of these categories, but I think are really important to reiterate. So we've got quite a tall agenda. I want to make sure that we can run through it. And I also want to take plenty of questions. So I will pause throughout the presentation to be a bit interactive, but also to make sure that we're answering questions along the way. So this is one of those moments. I want to know from you all, what have you found beneficial about online events and meetings over this past year? We've attended a lot of them. We've been doing a lot online. Are there advantages that you've found to the online meeting space? And we'll just pause for a minute or so to collect some of those. You can drop them in the chat. You can post them to the group, and Dr. Orsag or Dr. Orr will read those out, or you can send a direct message like they mentioned to them as well.
Great, so I'm going to start reading some of them. Convenient, not having to get from place to place, so we don't have to plan that travel time into our day. Being able to record the meetings. People who might not be able to get there can get there. So we used to be out at West Campus, and so for us, this would have been a great advantage when we were located out there. Being able to stay at their desk. Again, the recordings. Online meetings cut down on small talk, so sometimes we just hang out in the room for a while chatting, even though the meeting is over. Higher attendance at training, so we've definitely seen that also. Travel time again, being able to reach. So I think especially for those of us on main campus, we can actually have some people from dentistry or the health science center or other places that can actually attend the trainings. Let's see, some of the same. Again, some of the not being able to reach people you wouldn't be able to reach, not having to pay for parking. That's a good one if you have
That's
to
a great
travel
one.
someplace and drive. Okay, a lot of the same. Comfort, being able to get up and move around. So I know most of you don't have your cameras on, and that's kind of that, maybe you're eating your lunch or those kind of things can be definitely a benefit. There's like 20 more, but I think Justin may need to move along. So you guys can continue to look at the chat if you want to.
Absolutely, that's perfect, Christy. I appreciate that, and a lot of what I would expect. Those have been a lot of advantages for me personally. I remember, like Christy mentioned, being out on West Campus and literally having to bake like 15, 20, 30 minutes of travel time on either side of meetings into my schedule. Not convenient, not great. Transportation was a pain at times. So online meetings have been fantastic. Do you remember when we used to meet face to face? So on this slide, I have a picture of a woman who's presenting on imposter syndrome to a group, and online, or I'm sorry, physical presentations were, we're about a year and change removed from those, and we would gather together in that physical space. The presentation, the format of the presentation really hasn't changed. The tools really have, and so now we're Zooming everywhere. So I've got a picture of a laptop screen with the Zoom session and a coffee mug here shown on the screen. And that just the word Zoom, that verb Zooming, is funny to me. That's a part of our vernacular now. So we're using these tools, and I suspect we'll continue to use a lot of this even when things open back up. And I think the most important part about it all is we knew this with physical meetings, but now that things are so much more convenient, there are a greater number of people participating, and we don't know who's going to be there. On this image, we have a picture of a woman's hands taking notes, and then there's some blurred other individuals in that space. And the idea is that we just don't know. We don't know who's going to attend, so we need to be prepared. That accessibility and inclusion, those considerations, we need to bake those into our process. So I have some fast facts on disability here. 26% of Americans have some type of disability. I know that this number kind of fluctuates. It seems to have increased. And I think that there's a number of reasons for that. The aging population, the incidence of chronic illness. There are a lot of things that I think are contributing, but we're seeing that number. I feel like it's increasing. Worldwide, these statistics I thought were pretty interesting. 360 million have some type of hearing disability. 245 with a visual disability, and 190 with a physical disability. And I want to add kind of a clarifier to that. That would be a physical disability that would impact use of the hand or legs, where keyboard accessibility, physical accessibility is really necessary. And then the other statistic I have here is there was a 2017 study that was done that showed that about 30% of working professionals had a disability. One statistic I didn't include here, and I saw it in a couple of different things that I was reading through the past couple of weeks. 40%, it's estimated that 40% of American professionals have a learning disability of some type. And so I don't know where that exact study came from, but I will say that I saw that in multiple locations. And I think it just underscores the fact that we don't know who's going to show up. And there could be a myriad of reasons that there are barriers or impacts to their experience, and we need to be cognizant of that. So what types of barriers? Oh, shucks. Okay, I actually made a change to this. And I forgot last minute. I'll hit this slide, and then I'll be honest, it's a little out of order. So what types of barriers? There are barriers that exist with online events. I have a picture of a laptop here with a cracked screen. It's a black and white photo. I've been there. I've been had that sad laptop in my hands. And access is then disabled at that point, right? You don't have access. And so there are barriers to the online experience. We're going to talk about what some of the common ones are and how we work around those and work with those. But I also have sort of a reiteration of these benefits to the online experience. And I know that some of these were echoed, but I just want to reiterate these. No stairs to climb, right? The physical space can present some accessibility challenges. I was talking to a student the other day who talked about how they remember going into lecture halls where they would have to sit at the top, and maybe the next row of people would be, a couple rows ahead of them, and so they felt a little isolated. And now we're really sort of on the same plane. We're in the same space. There aren't any stairs to climb. And just a lot of those physical architectural barriers aren't a factor here in this online space. More direct audio. Okay, so why this one would be important is because a lot of times when you're in a big lecture facility, you've got a lot of ambient sound, right, in the space around you. My laptop audio is not the greatest, but you have a more direct connection to my voice. And I think that's really important. It's important for clarity with the captioning. It's important for your understanding auditorily. So more direct audio is important. Transportation limitations. And so you all mentioned that. That's fantastic, right? A lot of times we've got a cart to and from a physical location. That is not a barrier any longer. And then the environment can be more comfortable. And actually, in one of the edits that I made, I don't know how I sent you the wrong slides, but comfort was actually not the word in my final version. It's accommodating, right? Our physical space, we are very well aware. I'm very well aware of what my office has to offer and how to get the most out of my space. And so it is more accommodating. So barriers to online events. What are some of those things that can cause a barrier for our participant? Access to all spoken and visual content. So the words that I'm saying, the visuals that I'm using, you may have noticed I gave a textual description of what I look like. I've been describing my images. I know that there's some live captioning going on. The recorded archived version of this will have a caption with it. Those things provide access, but without those, they would be barriers to this experience. Controls which are unlabeled are only accessible with a pointing device. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into the platforms themselves, but being able to manipulate the controls, mute your microphone, turn your camera off, those are things that you can do with your mouse, but Zoom, for instance, has really good keyboard controls to do all of those things. And so when using a pointing device is not an option, the keyboard is a good alternative. Anxiety about virtual experiences and just being overwhelmed by some of the conferencing features, right? I know one of the first things that overwhelmed me about Zoom was just the volume of notifications, right? When you get a chat, when people would join the room, things like that. And those features can be barriers if we're not aware of that. And then not all platforms offer intuitive and accessible features. We'll talk a little bit about what some of those are. But I will tell you that in this last year, a lot of the platforms have come a long way, and there are ways around some of the inaccessibility pieces. So. All right, so it looks like I'm going to stop and pause and ask you a question. I'm just going to pose a question. It's hypothetical. When do you start planning for accessibility? The best time to plan for accessibility is when you're planning your event, right? The number of people that I consult with that will ask a question about accessibility kind of in the 11th hour, right? The event is next week. What do we need to do to make this more accessible? There's, second best time is today. The first best time was when you started planning. And so I think just being mindful that some of these things are necessary, it helps us plan a little bit better in the future. But accessibility preparation starts at ideation. It starts when we're talking about that event. So that's budget, that's accommodations, that's logistics, that's recognizing maybe who we know is going to be there, what things we know we want to have in place, how we set up our registration, things like that. So what makes an online event accessible? So I have sort of a four-step sort of approach to online program accessibility. They conveniently start with 4 Ps. I'm a big fan of alliteration. It's a little easy to remember. So you have promote, prepare, presentation, and participation. So those sort of the 4 P's to accessibility when it comes to accessible online events. And so we're going to go through each of these and what falls into each of those categories. And I hope it will be an easy way to remember some of those areas that we need to be thinking about as we plan events and we think about accessibility of our presentations. So promotion should be accessible, right? We know we're having an event. We know that we want people to come. We really have to sort of set the table for what they're going to get when they participate. And so I have here a close-up of a cell phone with several social media icons. A big way that we promote our events is through social media, right? Social media and email. And we have to make sure that the earliest instances of people interacting with our events, those are accessible too. So how do we make things accessible when we promote, right? How do we do that? And so I have a couple of reminders, a couple of suggestions here. It would be really hard for me to tell you how to do each of these in an hour, but at least this will get you thinking about what are the mechanics of accessibility in my promotion. Using an accessible design for emails. I know a lot of people build emails in Microsoft Word or in Outlook and build it in Outlook or copy it over from Word to Outlook. You can make your content accessible in Word and in Outlook, adding image descriptions, using headings and bullets and all of those things. And so when you email out that message, that promotional content, people are going to get an accessible message on the other end. Those are all very easy things to do as you're planning your communication. Making sure that landing pages and event sites work with assistive technology. So a lot of times if you're planning a big event, you might use a registration app or something on your website. It's just making sure that different assistive technologies, whether it's a screen reader or maybe somebody who's just using a keyboard, can get to all of those features. One great tip to do here that will catch a lot of accessibility issues is just use your tab key to navigate through the different fields of your registration form. And you'll see a little focus indicator, a little ring around which field has focus at that moment. And so if you were just using your keyboard, that's where your keyboard would start typing, right? And so if you just use your tab key, it should clearly tab down the fields in your form and through the controls and all of the aspects of your registration. If you miss that indicator, if it disappears on you or it jumps around kind of erratically, that's a good indicator that you might want to have somebody take a look at the accessibility of that system, right? Because that could be a barrier even before your event starts. Using captions and image descriptions when you share media on social media, right? So all of the major social media sites have methods for you to be able to add description to your image. Great example, Facebook and Instagram have an alternative text field. So if you were to go to edit your image, you'll actually see an option to add alt text. If you see alt text, that's essentially what a screen reader would read. So me being totally blind, my application would read out the description that you've typed of this image rather than just say that it's an image. Captions, you can provide a captions file, so like an SRT file. Facebook will take those. Not many services have support for SRT. And so a lot of times if you're sharing just a short promotional clip of a video on social media, what I recommend is just burning your captions into the video. Folks can't disable those, but it will provide access. And if it's a short promotional clip, I think people will appreciate that. Oftentimes I've talked to people and they say that, you know, sound is muted on social media anyway, so the captions are really nice so that they don't have to play the audio and they can kind of scan the video. So it's kind of has a universal design function too. And then informing prospective attendees of what you're going to do with accessibility. That's a really big important one. And I mentioned kind of setting the table. You are letting people know what the experience is going to be like on the front end, and that's really important.
Justin, we have a question.
Yeah, you bet.
So the question is, do transcripts help? And if presenters plan to work from a script, or is captioning alone better?
Chrissy, repeat that question because you cut out for me just a little.
Yeah, I think what they're asking is, it says, do transcripts help? And then it says, if presenters plan to work from a script, or is captioning alone better? So I think maybe just talk a little bit about working from a script and.
Absolutely. So captions are going to be synchronized text with the spoken feedback, right? A transcript is sort of a word for word representation of what was said. When communication is happening in real time, having that text presented in real time is necessary. There are certainly benefits to having both, but captions are really essential for real-time communication. And some presenters do work from a script. I would say if you're working from a script and you have somebody that's providing captions, provide that to your captioner, right? That's going to give them good feedback to know maybe if you're using some specialized vocabulary. It's also going to let that captioner know where you're going. So that's an important thing. So I've been reiterating this, promotion sets the table. I have a picture of some ramen noodles here on a table. We really want to let people know what they can expect. And I think setting that table is really important. Christy, I'm curious, do we have any other questions in the chat right now?
That is it. I think it's just a little bit, transcripts can be confusing. And I would say, I was typing, but I'll get your opinion too. I would say captions are always preferred.
Yeah.
A transcript can be okay depending on what the video looks like, but
right.
You know, if you think about a transcript is usually just, it's that word for word, not as helpful as actually having captions that go right along with what's being said. It just makes it easier access for anyone.
Absolutely. If you think about sort of having to jump from what's happening in real time, right? So I'm talking right now. If you were jumping back and forth from me talking here to a transcript in another window or another space, it's kind of a jarring experience, right? And it's pulling that person away from the experience. So captions definitely are preferred in a real-time environment like this. Absolutely. So we got through the first P, which was promote, and now we are at prepare. So preparing for accessibility. So I have kind of an assortment of hiking things. There's a map, there's a boot, there's some boots. There's a number of things, and it's really just sort of preparing for that journey, right? And so we want to prepare ourselves. We want to prepare our participants. We want to prepare any speakers for what's ahead. So how can we prepare? So I want to say I'm gonna read all of this on the slide, but I want to give you Megan. Dr. Ortag has been phenomenal at preparing both the participants and the speakers, the presenters for this event. It's good communication. It's letting us know what to expect. It's giving us some guidelines and parameters to work within. And I think that that's really important. And so, and it started honestly at the registration, right? There was an accessibility statement that was shared. And when we registered, we had the option to provide any accommodations that we knew that we wanted to request. And so that is a really big part of preparing. Again, you don't know who's going to be there, but if they tell you, hey, I'm going to be there and I need this, it gives us a better opportunity to prepare and plan. Be familiar with the accessibility features of the conferencing platform that you're using, right? So I am very familiar with what Zoom can do from an accessibility standpoint. And that helps me when I'm planning events, that helps me know what we can and cannot do accessibly as we gather together. All of these platforms, especially the big ones, Zoom, Google Meet, WebEx, totally just blanked on Adobe's. Adobe has one. I totally just blanked on it, but all of the major conferencing platforms, they have details on what accessibility they support. So they might have an accessibility page, they might have accessibility documentation. So Zoom is a great example where every feature that they have, they will tell you what is accessible and how to use that from an accessibility standpoint. So that's phenomenal. They all differ a little bit. A lot of it differs in how captions are provided, maybe some of the more advanced features. Keyboard support is a really big one, and Zoom has that. Google Meet also has that. So they all differ slightly, but it's important to know what sort of accessibility support do they offer. Kind of a good pro tip in that if a company has an accessibility page, it's not a surefire thing that accessibility is going to be 100%, but it does mean that they're thinking about it and they're listening to the feedback that their users have. And so that's really important. Give your attendees an idea of what to expect. You know, that may be an agenda, that may be some bullet points. Let them know what's on the roadmap for your event, because a lot of times when I attend an event, there may be different accommodations that I might request based on the activities, right? If it's just a lecture style presentation, I may not even need PowerPoint slides. But if there's some interactive activities, some whiteboarding activities, how do we make that accessible? And if I didn't know that that was an activity that was going to be happening, I wouldn't be able to consult with the host of the event. And so a lot of times just knowing what's around the corner, that gives me a good opportunity to be sort of the advocate and expert in that moment and share what would be helpful. And then this one's really important. Equip your guests and speakers with accessibility guidance. A lot of times we're going to be bringing people in who don't have the accessibility acumen that we do. And so it's really important that we equip them with a lot of the knowledge that we're aware of, so that if they're, giving a presentation, building a presentation, sharing media, when they're giving their presentation, actually, being conscious of those accessibility aspects. And then I kind of reiterate this, giving your speaker guidance. A lot of things that I find helpful, I've seen it within our own division as we've brought in guest speakers, just reiterating to them that captions are important if you're going to be sharing videos, just letting them know what your expectations are. Megan did a great job of letting us know, in advance what was expected. And so that's helpful. Here I have a picture of some signs at the feet that point left and right. I'm sorry, let's say here, there, and everywhere. Basically just to say that people need direction. Before I jump into the next section, I'm curious if there are any questions.
There are not in the chat. Does anyone have questions that they want to ask? Okay, we'll move on.
I'm going to jump ahead. So I'm going to move to our third P, which is talking about the presentation itself. And when I refer to presentation, I'm really talking about the slides. So I'm using PowerPoint right now. A lot of times you'll see Google Slides. When I was doing research to make sure I was covering all of my, dotting my I's and crossing my T's on this, came across a couple of presentations on SlideShare and Prezi. I will tell you that those platforms are not super accessible. So most of the time I'm going to build a slideshow in PowerPoint or Google Slides, and that's kind of what I advocate to people when they're building slides. So here I have a picture of a gentleman who's a wheelchair user, and there are escalators on either side of him. And it's really just building accessibility into the presentation, into the space that we're going to be sharing information. So what is the anatomy of an accessible presentation? I will tell you that this one slide right here could be like a presentation or two in itself. So I welcome any questions you might have on this. There are a lot of great resources. WebAIM is a phenomenal resource on accessible document creation presentations. But these are some of the elements that you really need to consider when you're thinking about an accessible slideshow. Clear, concise slide content, right? If I had from top left to bottom right, it was text, it would be overwhelming. There'd be a lot of information to have to digest while I'm talking at the same time. So from an accessibility standpoint, I'm facilitating good access, not just for disabled people, but having clear, concise text provides clarity, but it also helps people focus on the moment, right? Be in the moment so you can hear me rather than having to sit there and process all of the text on the slide. Bullet points a lot. Sometimes it's not even full sentences. A lot of times it's just hitting main points in a couple of words. Sometimes you have to break from that, but I think that the clearer we can be, the more pithy we can be in our points, I think the better. Image descriptions and caption media. So I've already talked about this a little bit, but it's being conscious that when you use an image, you use the alternative text feature that's built into PowerPoint or Google Slides. So a lot of times you can right click your image and there will be an option to like view your image options. I know in PowerPoint, in newer versions, you'll even see a label that says edit alt text, right? And so alt text, again, is that text that's going to be announced to somebody who is using a screen reader and working through your presentation non-visually. Caption media, if you use a video from YouTube that you own, you can provide captions. You can work with the owner of the video to maybe add captions or choose an alternative video. Sometimes it does come down to that. We want to make sure that we facilitate access in the media that we're sharing. Simple fonts and good color contrast. So that's kind of subjective on both accounts. I would say the best fonts tend to be fonts with straighter lines, right? So you're not using script or rounded fonts. The sans serif fonts where you don't have tails on the letters. Those fonts tend to be a little bit easier to perceive for people with learning disabilities, but they tend to be a bit more readable to everyone. Good font size, making sure that even when displayed digitally, people aren't having to squint or move in closer to their screen. And then contrast, right? So that the text stands out from the background. There are technical standards that you can kind of refer to in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They talk about a ratio of 4.5 to 1. Really, that just means you're not using pink on a red background or yellow on a white background. I tend to like the white on black or black on white. And I think you kind of work with what looks clear when you move back from your computer screen at a distance. Can you still see some clarity between that background and your text? So that's what I think about with contrast. Built-in slide layouts. This one sometimes is a little confusing. So when you go to PowerPoint and you add new slides, you have some built-in layouts, some templates that you could choose from. Like right now, I'm using a title and content template for this particular slide. Where we get into trouble with accessibility is when we start to kind of build our own, right? So we start adding text boxes and different elements to the screen. And a lot of times those will be picked up, but the order could get a little funky, right? And so when we use built-in templates or built-in slide layouts, there's a more predictable experience for accessibility. So things are read in the order that you put them, that you intended for them to be read in. And so that's really important. And then when you're sharing the file, it's making sure that you're sharing a PowerPoint file or a properly tagged PDF. Now you can save a PDF out of PowerPoint and it's going to have some tagging, but it's not perfect. And in fact, it's kind of the same with Word. It gets you close, but it's not perfect. And so oftentimes if I'm sharing a presentation, I'm just going to share the PowerPoint file because I know that it's going to be accessible when somebody gets that. I might drop it in a Google Drive folder. If it's large, or if it's a small PowerPoint document, just emailing it is fine. But PowerPoint is pretty accessible. You're not going to have to do too much remediation on that. The PDF is where you get into a little bit of trouble, making sure that all of the tags are there. Sometimes it will tag things as headings that aren't necessarily intended to be headings. So I think that PowerPoint is really the safest bet on that.
Justin, we had a comment about just another comment made my chat move, about just how database results like screenshots and anything with like a big chart with lots of numbers and rows and columns has been a challenge. And I think that is a challenge when you get to scientific kind of presentations or for conferences. I don't know if you have any comments on that or any suggestion or.
That's a great question, and there's a couple ways that you can do it. When you've got a lot of data, an image description is not really meant for tabular data. It's not meant to tell a whole narrative about a picture. It's really meant to be a sentence, 2 at max, because of just the way the screen reading app reads that out loud. If you've got a lot of data, you might consider adding an additional slide that spells out some of that data. you might point to a link where that data is referenced from, right? So a screen reader user could then go follow that link and get the original source of the data. You know, there's a couple different ways you can do it, and it's really going to be situationally. I know, for instance, so Christy, you and I are familiar with it really well when we provide our data for our office. You know, we have that, and it's in a chart a lot of the time. If it's just a graphic, we might explain it, but then we point back to our statistics page. And I think that a lot of times that works and it makes that accessible.
Yeah, that's great. And I think sometimes too, sometimes it may be that all that information is necessary, but sometimes it may not be. So do you really need to report the last 10 years? Or if you report the last 2, is that enough? So I think that's not always the answer, but sometimes that is the answer. And it looks like in the situation that Deb is talking about, that's exactly what the person did. They made a handout that was accessible to go with it. So that's great. There is also a question about Google Slides and if they're as accessible as PowerPoint.
That's a great question. And I believe, for me, and I'm just going to speak from myself because I've used both. PowerPoint's going to be my go-to. Google Slides has gotten a lot better. There is accessibility support. I have seen from time to time that Google, I don't know if it's just how the slides are put together. Sometimes the reading order will get a little funky. I don't know if that's a slide layout thing or if it's just how the person built the slides or if Google is just being silly. I have no idea. But I feel like Google has mixed results. I have used Google Slides to build some presentations before just to test it out. I would say if you can do PowerPoint, do PowerPoint. I will also say that if you do Google Slides, you can do a PowerPoint export, and it tends to do that pretty well. But you'll notice I'm kind of still leaning back toward the PowerPoint. So I would really say PowerPoint's probably your better bet.
Great. And I dropped in the chat the presentation templates from A&M. So I don't know that we've looked at them in a while. I use them a lot. I know they did some work early on about making sure that they were accessible. So I believe they are. So that's also, if you're looking at templates, using A&M, the branded templates from A&M should also be a good thought for you.
That's a really good point too, about like just contrast and readability when you're sort of working in like the scope of a brand. Color is not the only way to meet like a sufficient contrast ratio, right? So it could be color, it could be the thickness of the font, could be the size of the font. You know, maybe there's just a number of ways that you can work around that. And so if your brand colors don't provide the kind of contrast that is accessible, talk with your marketing and comms folks and work with them to see if there are ways that you can thicken that font, or work with a slightly different color. I don't know. There's options there. You just have to know what you're working with. So.
Okay, one more quick one about, and I'm guessing the answer is going to be the same as what you just said, but if you have a PowerPoint that's accessible in PowerPoint, slides that are accessible, and then you upload it to Google Slides, do you lose the accessibility that you built in PowerPoint?
So I will tell you that Google's PowerPoint slideshow viewer is pretty bad from an accessibility standpoint. So if I've got a PowerPoint that somebody shared with me via Google Drive, I end up downloading it. It's kind of that way across the board for a lot of assistive technology. So not just a screen reading app. I've got students that tell me all the time that they use PDFs. They try to use their assistive technology like text to speech to read PDFs and slideshows that are shared in Google. And it's just really mixed results when it works and when it doesn't. So I would just let your users have options. You know, from a presenter standpoint, a lot of times we can just upload to Google Drive and present right there from Google. But then your user can still download that PowerPoint file. So the other thing that I've noticed when I built PowerPoint presentations and uploaded them to Google, not to muddy the water, but you can open them in Google Slides right there from Google Drive. So, you know, maybe you use PowerPoint as the source and you're working in Google Slides to present, if that's kind of the collaborative nature of how you want to do things. So just a couple different ways that you can approach that. I know it kind of stinks when you feel like you're sort of sandboxed into one or two options, but they're really good options. PowerPoint's not a bad option. So those are all really, really good questions. I'm going to jump ahead and we're going to get to our last P, which is participate. And it's ensuring that everybody can participate, right? So a presentation is more than just slides and somebody talking. It's about engagement. So I have a picture of 3 boys with their dog on a pulley system here. And there's a sign that says "No girls allowed," and my goodness, like just the reality that we want everybody to be involved. We don't want to block somebody out, and so we can facilitate good, accessible participation if we're just aware of what we're doing. And I have a question for you. What characteristics do you think makes a good host for an event like this? You can drop them in the chat. You can direct message them to our moderators.
Okay, warm and welcoming. An animated host like Justin. Personable. Keeping in mind other perspectives, considering the audience and being aware, being prepared, engaging, asking them to respond to questions. So I think, again, that engagement, getting people talking. Yes, having someone moderate so that the presenter can focus while they're not ignored. Absolutely.
Huge.
And keeping a manageable pace, not too fast, not too slow. Friendly as opposed to just being professional and maybe kind of boring and stiff. Being warm and welcome and prepared, knowledgeable about the material. So a lot about engagement, how you make the audience feel, I think, is a lot of what the chats are there, Justin.
Absolutely. And I think, with the physical space, we sort of share that physical immediacy and that warmth, that welcoming feeling. A lot of that we get in just being in the same room. So I know I've had to personally adjust the way I present, the way I engage in a presentation, so that we can make sure that we're engaging with one another, we're facilitating presentation. It seems like it's a little easier when you're in a physical space, but there are so many ways to do this well with the conferencing tools that we have. So I have a picture of some dress shoes, arrows pointing left and right. It's a little ambiguous, a little unclear. And we want to clearly communicate our agenda. When you get in the room, what can you expect, right? Megan was so great at the beginning, sort of setting the tone. Here's what's going to happen. Here are your moderators. Drop questions in the chat. We've got captions that are going here. The session is being recorded, which means you're going to be able to get a recording of that session afterwards. A lot of things that are helpful so you can sort of meter your expectations and decide how you're going to participate and engage. Sharing materials in advance, right? So getting your PowerPoint slides to your participants. As a participant, if you need to review those, you've got the ability to do that. We've got a picture of Oprah here, dressed in red, shouting, you get a prize, you get a prize. It's just this idea that we're sharing with everybody. Everyone has access to the experience beforehand. That may be for use with a screen reader, right? Or maybe it's somebody who, processing new material can be really overwhelming. And so being able to just have an idea of what to expect, to kind of build that framework before you get together, that helps them understand and receive that when you're actually in the presentation. So I've got captions, transcripts, and American Sign Language. I've got a pencil drawing here of American Sign Language. We kind of talked a little bit about captions, transcripts. Didn't really mention ASL quite yet, but I'm going to break this down just a little bit. So you can have live captions. And in Zoom, those are actually closed captions so that which means you can toggle them on and off. You can have open captions, which are basically burned into a video. So you wouldn't have that in a conference. One situation where you might see open captions in a meeting like this is if your presenter uses Microsoft PowerPoint or Google Slides and the auto caption feature. I would encourage you not to use that, because then participants can't turn those off. And the difficulty with open captions is that it may be distracting to somebody, right? And so closed captions really give people the ability to toggle those on and off and meet their own needs. Transcripts, like Christy and I were talking about earlier, those are sort of that word for word report of something that was said. You can have live transcripts. They are not synced up with the media. So you wouldn't see them alongside the media. They might be in a separate window. A lot of times you see transcripts after the fact. And transcripts are going to have that spoken language, but they're also going to a lot of times have, sounds that might have happened. If there's music or background, like a sound that was intentionally played in the background, things like that, those are also included in transcripts. ASL would be sign language. So you would have an interpreter that is that's translating the spoken language into ASL. Someone who is deaf that uses ASL can then understand the spoken language. And so there are some distinctions between these three. It's important to know those as you're planning. Not all people who are deaf use sign language, right? And so you're really sort of leaning on the accommodation requests of the people who attend your meeting or your event. And a lot of times we get asked, do I need to go ahead and have these things at my event? These things do cost money and they do need to be planned for. I think it's a good idea to know if you're going to have captions available. We talk a lot about ASL isn't always necessary. And so you want to encourage your participants, if they need something like that, to make that request. You might even mention it in your verbiage so that they know to request it. But I would say that it is hard to budget for all of this. So just be conscious about the people that you're going to have and be prepared to pay for it when it's requested. It's just making accessibility seamless throughout the event. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I do have a picture of 3 sailboats on the water here. So how do we make accessibility seamless, right? So as a host, have somebody monitor and announce what's in the chat. So we've done that really well here. Things pop up, questions along the way. Christy and Megan are catching them. Describe visuals and slide content. Let people know when you're changing activities or scenes. So, sometimes, we may do an activity that requires you to open a link or open a document, right? And so let's be very clear when we're transitioning between those things so that people know this is coming up. Be flexible with camera use. And we've kind of even mentioned this already. Some people just aren't comfortable with their camera on. I was in a meeting a couple weeks ago. Chris, was in the same meeting. I had some back pain. I had to stand up. I just turned my camera off. I let people know that was what was going on. I didn't have to do that. We're in a lot of meetings where that camera use is flexible. And so that may be necessary for a disability related reason, but maybe there are other factors that are going on. And that camera being turned on could be a distraction to other people. And so we just need to be mindful that not everybody's experience is like ours. And so we need to be flexible. Encourage participants to be inclusive as they engage. And what I mean by that is if we had a large group meeting where a bunch of people were talking, it's a good idea to announce names before people speak. So, if we were going to have 3 or 4 different speakers, this is John, and then John continues. This is Mary, and then Mary continues, right? Because for people who may be on the phone, right? They're connecting via phone. This helps, let people know who's speaking. Really important for people who are not looking at the screen or who don't have that ability.
Justin, we had a couple of comments in the chat that they said that you are seamlessly describing your pictures, and they really appreciate that and are going to imitate that. And I just highly encourage you. It's a little awkward when you first start. I'm not encouraging you, Justin, because you do it, but everybody else. It's a little weird when you first start, but I think once you start doing it, it kind of feels really good to describe what it is. And also it gives you the opportunity sometimes to point out why you're showing the image. And so, sometimes we put up a cartoon or something, and even if someone can see it, they may not have that context of why is that funny or what's the point of that picture. So when you're describing it's what we call universal design, which is not what this program is about, but really it's making it more accessible for everyone. And so it's just a great way to be able to share the images and explain it to people.
Christy, one other thing, you know, and I said this just a minute ago with the names, but that's also another reason why describing your images is important. What if you've got somebody that's calling in not from the app, but from the telephone, right? They're not seeing those visuals. So again, universal design, enhancing that, not just for people with disabilities, but it really benefits everyone.
And I will share, Justin, just because you are blind, and we have been in meetings together before where people have put up slides, and maybe it's a cartoon, and they put up the slide and don't describe it, and everyone in the room laughs.
Everybody laughs.
And it is so uncomfortable,
It
and
is.
in our office, of course, we're explaining to Justin or to Julie in our office who are blind what is in the cartoon, but it's so exclusionary, and I'm sure there's other people that maybe didn't understand the cartoon even if they could see it. So it's just a great way to be able to include everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Were there any others you wanted to hit right now?
No, they're just all really liking that. So, and about the fact that it does explains the purpose for the image. I think that's one thing, when you're talking about the charts earlier, or a lot of the things in your presentation is we just plot pictures in and things like that without really thinking about why. And so when you're having to put alternative descriptions, and when you're having to do some of those things, you really think about, like, do I want that picture there, or do I need all that information in the chart? So really being intentional and purposeful with your presentations is part of the accessibility.
I do have a couple of just inclusion ideas for participants. I've mentioned announcing your name, just being mindful if there's a larger group, if you've got multiple people speaking, just say your name. Hi, this is so-and-so, here's my comment. Keeping your microphone muted, everyone has done a really good job, but that can get distracting. It can be complicated for captioning and transcription, right? And so just making sure that you're muted. Keeping unrelated conversation. Now, this one is interesting. The chat can get a little noisy. And if you've got people using assistive technology, even people who are viewing the screen visually, there are notifications that pop up all the time. And just being conscious about what happens when you send that message, I think, is really important. So it's not to say don't use the chat. It's to say be conscious about how you're using the chat. And so I think that those are really some things that we can do as participants to just be focused on inclusion. So odds and ends go here. I have a picture of a junk drawer. I know we probably all have these in our houses. So choosing a conferencing platform. So a monkey stares at the camera with wide eyes and a drop jaw. That's what my image description says here. I love monkeys. Choosing a conferencing platform, right? So there are a lot of options to choose. I didn't want this to become a presentation where I told you to pick one over the other. They all have their advantages. I feel that Zoom and Google tend to do the best with this accessibility. But again, where are your people? What are you trying to accomplish? What types of activities are you going to be doing? And do you have a plan if your platform does not make that natively accessible? And so whiteboarding is one activity that I know we'll do sometimes in meetings. And a lot of these conferencing platforms don't have accessible whiteboarding features. And so a lot of times what I've suggested is, well, let's open a Google Doc and share that with the whole group, and then we can all be working in the same Google Doc. There are ways around a lot of situations. You just have to be mindful about where those barriers are and how are we going to need to work around them. Appoint somebody to coordinate accessibility. So I have a picture of a queen knighting a person with a sword here. Appoint somebody who's sort of the direct contact for accessibility. When you're planning an event, it's hard to be everything to everybody. It's hard to do everything. If you have somebody that's sort of coordinating or spearheading those accessibility efforts, you've got one person to contact, you've got one person who's aware, they can maybe resource with other agencies, other groups. I'm not saying you have to do it this way, but I will say that when I've worked with groups, this tends to be something that helps. And then adding captions or transcripts before you post your recording. So you know, who are you going to provide that video to so that they can generate your captions and your transcripts? I've worked with Rev. Again, I don't want to get into specific vendors, but there are lots of them. You will find a lot of options there. I do have a picture of a stop sign here, and it's just, you know, pause. Make sure you know what you're going to do with your captions and your transcript. So that is the end of my presentation. Looks like we've got about 5 minutes. I'm curious if that sparks any thoughts, and if you have any questions.
I don't see anything in the chat yet, but we'll give you a minute or two to think about that and put anything in there that you have. I think one point, Justin, someone, they're just saying that it's good information so far, as are the comments. One point is that a lot of what you've shared is helpful for in-person meetings too. So, you know, definitely if you are in an in-person meeting with PowerPoints, all the things that you talked about would be what you would want to do in those meetings also. So you can transfer all of this information to whether you're in an in-person meeting or a Zoom meeting or other meeting that is online. Awesome. Oh, when sharing PowerPoints or Word documents, if you lock it to prevent editing, is it still accessible?
That is a great question. I'm trying to remember. I do think it still works with assistive technology, with some assistive technology, but here's the deal. So screen reading technology can typically get around that kind of stuff, but text-to-speech apps generally can't because they have to copy the text and then read it out loud. Better to share an unlocked document or maybe a PDF, you know, share an accessible PDF instead of the Word document. As long as it's accessible, you then give it to them where they can't edit it. So there's a couple ways around that, but I think generally speaking, it works with some, but not others. And working with some, but not others isn't really accessible. So just something to think about.
That's a great point, Justin. Oh. When the chats keep going, it makes it hard to keep up. Cluttering the chat. Can you, oh, somebody asked about that. You froze for a minute when you were talking about cluttering the chat when there's a lot of chats going on. Can you explain that real briefly? Yeah,
absolutely. Such a great one. So I actually had a real life situation a couple weeks ago where I was in a chat and somebody sent a message and the presenter got really distracted. Another person that she was talking to got really distracted. And it was a point that didn't need to be made right then. I think it's recognizing that when we're in a physical presentation, we're not having side conversation with one another. It might be done through like a text message or an email, but we're not using that shared space to talk to one another. And I think that we could have that same consideration when we're in the digital space. Again, I'm not saying that all conversation is not conducive. I'm just saying, does that have to be said right now to the large group at this moment in this space? And I think it's just being conscious about what we're saying and when we're saying it. My screen reader often reads out every message that's sent. And thankfully I can turn off when people leave or come into the room, but it's a lot of notifications at once. And I know auditorily it's overwhelming, but I know visually it can be overwhelming too. And it's sort of being conscious about not cluttering that space. I hope that's helpful. I throw that one out there because I know that it's been meaningful to me over the past couple of months. And I think it's just something that we can think about and definitely how it differs in the physical space.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thought would be how we could have set it up if we wanted to is we could have said just private chat with myself or Megan and we'll ask the questions to Justin and that way he wouldn't have been distracted and we would have just been moderating those. We've chosen to do a little bit differently, but that might have helped.
Yeah, for sure. And I will tell you that Zoom just recently introduced the ability for me to toggle off notifications for like chat messages. So that helps. But it also means that if an important one comes in right now, I've got to constantly be monitoring the chat. So I miss messages now. So it's all a balance. We just have to be conscientious that that could be a barrier if it got out of control. if the host sets up, let's use the main chat for questions, then I think we just have to be aware of what that space is going to look like.
Okay, we're really out of time, but Justin, I'm going to ask you this one question because I know it's a question that people are probably curious about. But the curiosity was, are you using a screen reader right now? So if you could briefly kind of explain, when you do a presentation, how are you doing that? You have it all memorized?
Yeah, I am using a screen. I am using a screen reader. I can't memorize any of this stuff. My memory is terrible. So yeah, I'm using a screen reader. I will pause sometimes. I have some lengthier text or image descriptions that I had, so I had to read them just to make sure I was telling you everything. But my screen reader will read the text, and I'm going line by line, kind of reading my points. It did give me the image descriptions because I put those in there. And you know what? I felt like it worked out. But it did take some practice being able to present and read PowerPoint slides at the same time. So.
Great, thank you for sharing that. I know sometimes people are curious, and I appreciate them asking so that you can answer that question.
I appreciate it as well.
And they thought maybe you had it all memorized because you talked about the alliterations with the 4 Ps. So Megan, do you want to close us out? I know we're over our time.
Thank you guys so much for your time today. I will be following up with an email, and the email is going to include an evaluation link that will help us improve our webinar series and just give us feedback so we can get better. But we want to thank Justin for his time today. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. As always, it's been a pleasure working with you, Justin, and thank you, Dr. Orr, for helping to facilitate this conversation. And everybody, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, y'all have a great day. I'm going to pause recording.